So in the last video, we kind of did an introduction to the Cold War. And so it kind of gave a broad overview of the big issues that were going on post World War II. And then we kind of talked about the Iron Curtain a little bit, and specifically, now we're going to kind of break this up into a little bit more digestible size timeline here. So this is kind of the post-war and Iron Curtain part 2. So we kind of start here essentially, we talked about how, and we asked the question, how does World War II change Europe, and how does the U.S. respond to that, right? Because the globe is all every nation on the planet is going to have to deal with the fallout of this question. What's going to end up happening? And Asia is going to be a major factor in the Cold War, and then eventually the Cold War is even going to stretch all the way to Cuba, and it's going to be right on our front doorstep, and that's going to become a major issue once we get into the 50s even, and 60s. So we continue to kind of go through this. You end up having the death of Vladimir Lenin, and the Soviet Union's new communist leader is a guy named Joseph Stalin. And Stalin actually helped the Allies during World War II, and we talked about him quite a bit. But and if you wanted to go back and kind of look at that and review that, but Stalin was the one who really began that process of expanding the USSR after World War II and taking all those satellite nations and doing all that and really created the USSR. Now, during the war, they helped each other. Stalin wanted to defeat the Nazis just as much as the Americans did, but they had very different ideas about what the world should look like after that. So, however, World War II, again, Stalin is no longer trusting the U.S. or Great Britain, and they don't trust him either. He felt like they were deliberately left, to the devices of the Germans, that the U.S. and the Great Britain deliberately let Germany invade, and then they took their time giving them aid. We talked about that, right? That 20 to 25 million Soviets died during World War II. And again, Germany had already invaded them twice. So Stalin, he really thought, if we don't set up this buffer zone, if we don't do these things, we're going to be left hanging out to dry again, and it won't be long. So he had his own motivations, but realistically, he was just a murderous dictator. He's probably one of the biggest murderers in the history of planet Earth. Yeah, I mean, right up there with Hitler and Mao. Zedong in China. We'll get to him. And so, he kind of pushes this idea that, the United States and that they hate Russia and that Great Britain wanted the Russians to die so that they could have more power, and he pushes this narrative through state-controlled media, and really it's a conspiracy theory that he uses to really get control and power. And so it was very effective because the communist state ends up reigning all the way till 1991, 92 range. So now, there's a lot of bitter feelings going on, but the U.S. and Great Britain are really afraid of Stalin. And they're afraid that he's going to continue to try and spread communism all over Europe. And Stalin was far more of a dictator than Vladimir Lenin ever had been. And where, he proves that quite obviously when he kills those millions of people in his own country that, just might disagree with him or might have ideas that are different than his. Instead of trying to, convince them, he said, I don't have time to convince you, I'll just shoot you. And we're talking millions and millions of Russians. Right after they'd been killed in World War II, Lenin comes in and goes, oh, we're communists and we're going this direction. And if anybody was like, I don't know if that's a good idea, he'd be like, well, you're dead, so it doesn't matter what you think. And so he is very militant. He would pass these, pamphlets, where Stalin, we passed them out where Stalin's this big giant octopus, and so basically we're afraid that they're going to get the communist tentacles in South America and Africa and Asia, and that communism's going to take over, and communism's bad for capitalism, clearly. So we don't want that to happen. Because we want to make sure, basically, that Britain and France and Western Europe and Western Germany, they stay democracies, right? We want to keep them democratic because that serves our interest as the United States. And, I mean, obviously, it's better that way because democracy is better than communism. Communism's very bad because 99% are poor and 1% is rich, and it's a bad system. There's no way to move up. There's no way to make yourself better. It's just, it sucks. But the Soviet Union is going to control East Germany and Eastern Europe, and they're going to set up those communist governments there. And ultimately, the rest of the world becomes the playground between the United States, who's trying to prevent it from spreading, the Soviet Union, who's trying to continue to spread it. This is what Europe kind of looks like after the war, the gray areas and the green, and the dark green down here, and it doesn't look dark green, it looks kind of black on the screen, but those are going to try and remain neutral, okay? They're going to try and stay neutral, that they don't pick a side, USSR or, the West. So, but everything in the blue goes Democratic. Everything in the red is Russian communist. And so, and then you have this little, gray with red slashes that has heavy communist influence on it. All right. And so we look at Germany specifically. This is Germany. We said it was divided into 4 sections. The 3 that were France, America, and Britain all joined together. The other side stays with Russia. And then you also, that basically the exact same thing happens with the city of Berlin. All right. So both sides are very afraid of each other. They're both prepping for war because they think that if anybody ever really crosses that line and it goes from cold to hot, we're going to have, a big military. So we have this huge military industrial complex that basically becomes the foundation of our economy for the next 70 years. The fact that our spending on military, it makes up about 60% to 70% of our entire yearly budget in the United States. If you took that money out of the economy, we would crash. That money that we spend on military literally fuels the entire American economy. That's why people in Washington, D.C., and there's a lot of people that say that those people, Congress, everybody is pro-war. They want war, both Republicans and Democrats. They may say that they don't, but, and again, this is what is kind of the political commentary of today is they want war because war makes people money. War puts money into the economy because you can't sell tanks to people down the street or nuclear bombs. But I can spend your money on it if I take your taxes and then buy that. And then that way the government's putting money into the economy. I mean, you're talking, like I said, 70% of the budget is on military spending in the Department of Defense.
So, if a war starts, do taxes go up?
No, because we're constantly spending our taxes on stuff for war. Yeah. I mean, we spent trillions and trillions of dollars in Iraq and Afghanistan and accomplished nothing. But it didn't really matter because it kept our economy afloat. It always does. So it is kind of, it's kind of weird that both parties are not exactly anti-war, right? It's what holds us together. It props up the entire economy. It's a way for the government to get money into the economy. So it's very effective. And so each side's going to be preparing for war. And it's very scary because, you start, the Cold War isn't really cold. It's only cold because the U.S. and Russia never get into a fight. There are many battles, like proxy wars between the U.S. and Russia, where the U.S. and Russia are not necessarily fighting each other, but the U.S. is supplying everything to the people who are fighting against another group that Russia is supplying everything to, like in Vietnam or in Korea. Those were wars between America and Russia. but we never had to kill each other's troops, so we never had to actually declare war on each other. We were basically just letting each other kill each other's, like letting other people kill each other's troops. Okay? But they are worried that if something does pop off, it's going to be bad. Again, Berlin, you look at the different zones, the French sector, British sector, American sector, then the Soviet sector over here. And, you know, they get half, and then these three get a third of the other half. And so you have democratically elected democratically elected city government over here, communist-led city government over there. I mean, completely split in every single way. The Berlin Wall is obviously built. You could not get from this side to this side. Capitalism on one side, communism on the other side. I mean, just very, very kind of crazy. And, you know, there's some very, people sold parts of this wall because people went and, like, painted the whole wall. And, like, there's lots of, like, graffiti, and some of it was very, like, expensive. So when they tore it down, they, like, preserved parts of it, and, like, people have it in their houses. It's kind of weird. Whatever. You know. Yeah. Again, you have, you know, this was not a joke. Like, the Russians put tanks on the other side and said, don't come here. We don't want any Western influence here at all. We don't want anyone from that side. And that was before they built the wall. At first, they just had, like, they put, like, landmines out there and stuff. Like, you can't come across here. Like, barbed wire, crazy stuff. Put tanks there. Do not come across this wall. And so it was really, really kind of crazy. You see here major barbed wire, all of this stuff, before they made it a big giant wall. Look there, these kids are just like, I want to see what's over there, right? Like, just curious. Because there were people who, you know, they lived before the Soviets came in. I mean, you might have somebody that lived in Berlin and their parents were living over there the day that the Soviets took over, and you were living over here, and there was no like, hey, you got 3 days to, you know, pick your side. It was when the Soviets took over, it was whoever's on that side is there, and whoever's on that side is there, period. So there were mothers and kids and all these things like that didn't see their families for like 50 years. They were separated by this wall, point blank, done. There was no way to get out of the eastern side, and so it was kind of messed up for sure. But you have to understand that it's kind of, the Berlin Wall became indicative of just how much separation there was between the two. The Russians, I believe, built the wall. They wanted to keep the West out. I don't think the American side built the wall. Like, I don't think that we weren't trying to we wanted them to get out. So here's the thing. If you're a communist country and you have to build a wall to keep people in, you must not have very much confidence in your government system. If it's so great and it's the best, why would you ever want to keep people from leaving? Why would they want to leave if it's the best, right? And why would you not want anybody to come in? What are you worried about? Well, clearly, there you go. It sucks. That's why, right? But you don't need, if anybody in your country knows it sucks, they'll revolt and try and leave. So you can't let them know that it sucks. So you just make them think that it's how everybody is. And that's kind of what they do in North Korea. Like, people in North Korea think that they are the greatest country in the world because they have zero outside influence. None. They get no news. I think it was like 2012, they told their country they won the World Cup. They beat America like 17-0. Actually, I think they lost. Oh, no, they tied Brazil because they have respect for them. They like tied them in the beginning rounds. But yeah, and then they won the World Cup. Their chief guy, Kim Jong-un or whatever, the oldest one, you know, when they first got taken over, like, you can go read about it, like, in his biography, they said that, you know, he only played golf one time, and he hit 18 hole-in-ones. He only, on his first attempt ever, he hit 18 hole-in-ones and decided that he didn't enjoy it because it was too easy, so he never played again. And that's what they believe. That's like in their textbooks. And they have no reference point because nobody else plays golf. You know, they stage sports like it's crazy. I mean, so that they can promote how great their country is, even though their people are starving to death. They go, hey, you think you're hungry, but in other parts of the world, they can't even feed kids. They can't even do, like, you know what I mean? So, like, they make it seem like their country is the best country in the world. And their people have no idea that it's not. And that's how communism has to work, because communism sucks. And you have to basically control the narrative, or else your people are going to know it sucks. And that's how Russia did it, and that's how North Korea does it. It's pretty crazy. Yeah. Look up some of the stuff that North Korea, like, you hear stories about it, that it's like, what? Like, that's crazy. All right, so we're going to just keep rolling as fast as we can. Sorry. We got to. All right, now, we're going to hit some of the big things, the Cold War at home, the Berlin airlift. Remember, Truman is the president in 1945 after FDR dies. He has never won an election. He was the vice president, but he is going to run in 1948 against a guy named Thomas Dewey, and then two other candidates. And it's, you know, when all of this happens, people don't think he's going to win. In fact, the early results came back that he had actually lost. And one of the most embarrassing, like, journalistic miscues in American history is that the Chicago Daily Tribune wanted to get, like, the first article out there calling, Dewey the winner. And so before all the votes came in, they were like, oh, he's definitely going to win. So they put out an early edition that says, Dewey defeats Truman. And then later on that, by morning time, Truman had pulled ahead, and so here you see Truman holding up a newspaper. It says Dewey defeats Truman while he does his acceptance speech. Yeah, that's pretty rough, bro. That's a gangster move. I'm not going to lie to you. That's pretty funny. He's like, oh, yeah, if y'all haven't heard, I lost. JK, I beat him, which is pretty funny. So, yeah, they were a little premature on that. So Truman actually ends up winning. It's not even close, which is kind of funny. Like, Harry Truman actually gets 303 electoral votes to 189 by Dewey. So I don't even understand why they called it early. I mean, you have about 2.2 million votes difference there. I mean, it's like 5%. I mean, it's really not that close, even in the popular vote. But it's just kind of funny. So even if he had gotten the other votes, he still wouldn't have won. So it doesn't even really matter. So it's just funny that they messed that up. The first challenge that Truman deals with during his time as president is the Red Scare. The second one's going to be the Berlin airlift. Clearly, the Red Scare is a reference to the Soviet flag that you've probably seen with the hammer and sickle. And so we called it the Red Scare because their flag was red, and we then associated communism with red, which it just became very synonymous with each other. There's nothing in communism that embraces the color red or anything like that in the doctrine of communism. It doesn't make sense why red, other than it was just the Soviet flag. And so there's a huge fear that, they're going to infiltrate our country, and actually Hollywood is considered to be very far left at the time. And so communism is kind of thought as a very liberal idea. It is. It's a very, very far left ideology in that, everybody shares everything, and everybody, takes care of each other, and nobody has any property. We just all work together. Like, that's very progressive and left-leaning. And so people fear that Hollywood is actually encouraging communism. So you kind of see there's this push to have these like anti-communist movies that are like portraying, oh, I married a communist, a thriller, it's like, or the Red Menace, so it's this kind of stuff that people are trying to say like, hey, keep an eye out, look out for those Reds, they're trying to get us, they're trying to infiltrate our economy, they're trying to infiltrate our government, they're trying to melt the minds of your children to embrace communism. And so it becomes very a psychological thing, but also people are scared of them because they end up with nuclear bombs, and that's scary. The Truman administration is seen as soft on communism, but he does take several steps to try and deal with it. He orders background checks for every civilian that goes into service to the government. He starts the House of American Activities Committee, which investigates communist subversion in the government and in Hollywood and in society. And this was pretty messed up. They actually start to put people on what's known as a blacklist if they were a suspected communist, which basically barred them from getting certain jobs, especially when it came to like unions. People saw unions as very, communist-leaning organizations because, it's all about, oh, we're working together as a working class against the rich elites. And people are like, that's communism. And so unions there was a big fear that unions would fall into full-out communism and the far left propaganda because, communism's whole thing is, value the workers. And if you're in a union, you're a worker and you probably feel undervalued. And so there's a big push to be like, hey, we need to make sure that the unions don't become communist. And so we actually start to kind of purge leftists and communists from union ranks. If you, supported any communist cause, you'd be kicked out and prosecuted and stuff like that and blacklisted again. It was very, very wrong to do, and it was very paranoia. It was from paranoia, really, of communism. We also need to keep in mind that the U.S. stays cold in the U.S., but we don't break into World War III, but a lot of the war is fought through spies and espionage. You have this man, Alger on the left, was State Department official and a communist spy. He was actually in the government and was a communist spy. He was passing on sensitive information from his State Department position to this guy, Whittaker, who was actually a Time magazine editor. And they were both prominent individuals, and Chambers essentially was the courier. So this guy worked in the State Department. He's giving information to this guy. This guy, because he's a journalist, would sometimes make trips to the Soviet Union to report about how bad communism is. But in reality, he's taking U.S. secrets and passing them to the Soviets. So there were real spies in the government. But they're certainly not this is not James Bond here, okay? These guys are not super spies that you might think about. These are just dudes. This ain't Jason Bourne. My gosh, that's Jason Bourne. It's not. This guy's too fat to be Jason Bourne, okay? Yeah. And so, obviously, but they are just average people going about their normal lives, betraying their country, And so both of them actually get convicted on espionage charges. And once that happens and that gets out in the paper, then the fear of, well, how many more of these people are there really takes over, And so then it becomes kind of a witch hunt. Then it turns into, are you a communist? Are you a communist? How would we know? This is just regular people, And so they actually, they're afraid of communism. They investigate Hiss, gets Chambers to reveal, that they're spies. And they kind of give him a plea deal so maybe he'll report on his whole, spy ring. Richard Nixon, who was actually a young congressman working on the committee, on the HUAC committee, was very, very vigorously went after them, and they do end up trying to convict them, and they do convict them eventually. And you can see here, this is a very young Richard Nixon. And it was called pumpkin espionage. That's what they called it, it really was called that. Now, more troubling was this group. This was, they end up convicting these two people. This is Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. Now, this was a really crazy story. It's very controversial even today, especially because they are the first civilians ever executed for espionage. They actually killed both of them for being spies. Yeah, no joke. I mean, they've killed people in the military. If you're a military spy, they just shoot you and move on, right? But civilians, it's very difficult to arrest and execute American civilian citizens for espionage, but they do. A lot of people still think that the punishment didn't fit the crime, but who knows? So there is some controversy on this, and there are some who are sympathetic to the Rosenberg case, and they say they shouldn't have been convicted. The problem is that, Julius Rosenberg was a very enthusiastic contractor. He was a contractor for the Army Corps of Engineer Laboratories. And so basically he was involved in the top end science in the American government and armed services. And so obviously this makes him a very attractive spy because he's working on technology for the Army in 1944. So they recruited him all the way back in 1942. And now what's going on in 1942? What are we working on? The atomic bomb. And they recruit him, and then after a couple years of getting some information, they actually turn him into a recruiter himself. And so he actually ends up building his own spy ring within the technologies department of the armed forces. And so he has people that are reporting to him. Now, one of the guys that he recruits is a guy named David Greenglass, who is his brother-in-law. And Greenglass actually is working on the Manhattan Project at the Los Alamos lab in New Mexico. So it is someone who literally had the plans for the atomic bomb. And he gives some of those secrets to the Rosenbaums, who pass them on to the Soviets. And all of a sudden, we realize, the government discovers this spy ring is going on, and they arrest Greenglass on June 15th of 1950. And so originally he names his wife and Julius as co-conspirators, but he does not name his sister Ethel. And you can see here he later changes his story on that clearly, but I guess he was trying to keep her name out of it and all of this. But he confesses to the FBI to doing this. And they raid the Rosenbergs' home. They arrest Julius and Ethel. And she testifies, hey, I didn't know that they were spies. Now, that seems fairly unlikely. They arrested her, I guess, in hopes that they would get more names out of Julius. And they were putting pressure on him saying, hey, I know that y'all were involved together. If you don't give us more people, then we're going to charge her with it too. And I think that they were trying to get it, but he doesn't make a deal with them really. And they end up being sentenced and convicted. After the trial is over, they're convicted. The judge comes up, he says, well, here's the sentencing guidelines. I can either, according to the law, put you in prison for 30 years or execute you. And believe it or not, the FBI director, J. Edgar Hoover, actually told the judge, give her a 30-year sentence. And after she spends a couple years in jail, maybe she'll, feel more likely to tell the truth and give us more. And the judge's name was Irving Kaufman, decides, no, we'll just kill her, and executes them both. I mean, the judge didn't kill them, but had them executed. David Greenglass he gets a 15-year sentence and only served 9. He's the one that actually stole the atomic bomb plans. Yeah, but it was the Rosenbergs who passed them on to the Russians. Again, They were executed by electric chair in June of 1953. First civilians ever for selling nuclear secrets. And to be honest with you, it's their fault. Now, they would have eventually got the bombs. The Soviet Union would have eventually probably figured out how to make it. But all evidence that has come out, in the last 10 years, 15 years, says that they were at least 3 or 4 more years away from getting close to having the bomb technology. So it shot them forward really far, and really created a problem, and set up the Cold War to be what it was. And so, yeah. You also had Joseph McCarthy, who is a Wisconsin senator, who comes out and says, I have a list of 205 names of communists that are working in the government. And so people are all scared, and they're like, oh, tell us who it is. And he's like, well, I'm going to. Let's have some investigations. And this makes him very powerful because he basically has, got the attention of everybody, and he's the one who can find them, and he's got the list. Well, later on, they're like, well, who is it? And he's like, well, actually, it's not 205. It's like 67. They're like, well, who is it? And he's like, well, actually, it's like 57. And then they actually never find any. He never finds any. He ends up being very disgraced. He never really does anything, but he does basically pour gasoline on the Red Scare and terrify people and make people very, very paranoid. And so, yeah, he definitely didn't help. He said, oh, yeah, the army is being led by communists. And the army was like, you need to stop talking now. Like, we're not communists. You need to shut up. But it made him very popular, very famous, and he liked the power. All right, the second issue, and we're kind of moving through this, is the Berlin airlift. Here's the problem. We talked about Berlin is all the way in the Soviet section, right? But you have people living there that are not Soviets. How do you get them supplies?
Packages with a thing.
Literally, there's trains, but the Soviets wouldn't let the Americans and them send supplies to their people in the non-Soviet section of Berlin. So they literally had to figure out, like, how are we going to get stuff to them? How are we going to get them food? How are we going to get them all this stuff if the Soviets won't let us, use trains and stuff? And it was really messed up. I mean, so for literally 11 months, they had to airdrop 4,000 tons of supplies every day into West Berlin. It took them 11 months before the Soviet Union realized that, like, this is not going to be sustainable. We can't just lock them out forever. And again, you have to remember, the Soviets don't want to go to war either. That would not have gone well for the Soviets. If they had gone to war with the United States, it would not have gone well. Stalin had just killed 6-7 million people. They lost 25 million fighting age people and civilians in World War II. They'd lost 30 million people in the last 6 years. They don't want to go to war. And I think Stalin realized, like, oh, I need to stop poking the bear, right? Because we were still very, very willing to kick the crap out of everybody. 200,000 supply missions were made, which is pretty impressive solution that Stalin basically miscalculated, that the West would just unite and say, we don't need to drive on your roads. But basically, eventually, they did end the blockade, and we were able to get supplies regularly to Berlin in a normal fashion. Again, you look at the East and the West and how that all breaks down. The last thing here is NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It was a military alliance between the United States, Canada, and most of Western Europe. Now, this has expanded to a huge number of nations. I think there's like 50 nations in NATO now. NATO really intensified Russia's fear of the West because now, if Russia got into a fight with anybody in the West, we would all rain down on them. And so not only do they not want to go to war with America, but if they had to go to war with America, it would result in going to war with the entire world. It'd be us against Russia, everybody against Russia. And so France said, hey, we'll only join if you help us reestablish our colonial empire, which America didn't really want to do, but we needed France to be on board with it. And so we kind of helped them reestablish like Vietnam, and Vietnam was really our fault because we kind of put them back in charge of it, which we shouldn't have done. That was our bad. It was really stupid. And so it was kind of messed up. But yeah, it was really dumb. Now, NATO has been in the news here recently because NATO is really the reason that Russia says they invaded Ukraine, because we were trying to get Ukraine to join NATO for absolutely no reason whatsoever. I don't really understand why. But then Russia was mad about it. They were like, I don't want a NATO ally right on our border. Stop doing that. And they told us, if you make Ukraine a NATO member, we're going to invade them. And then we kept pushing it and kept pushing it and kept pushing it. And we were basically saying, no, you won't. No, you won't. And then he's like, okay, I'm going to do it. And that's how we kind of ended up in the Ukraine war.
Is it still going?
Oh, yeah. And Russia's winning. You hadn't heard anything about it because Ukraine is losing. We start building nuclear weapons at an alarming rate because when we figure out how to do it, we make it really cheap. Once we invent the hydrogen bomb, instead of having to have uranium and plutonium, the hydrogen bombs are several magnitudes stronger than the other bombs are. Like, you're talking about the bomb that landed on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The Hiroshima was the bigger one, right? And so, yeah, I think it was. Maybe Nagasaki. It doesn't matter. The ones we got now are like 1,000 times stronger than that. Like, it's ridiculous. And so, nuclear threat basically was the way that we were going to get what we wanted. It became very popular. Like, hey, if you don't stop talking crap, we got nukes, and you don't. Until Russia had nukes, and then we were like, crap, how'd they get nukes? Spies. Yeah, so there we go. It became an arms race, obviously. Russia ends up testing a bomb in 1949, and we're like, how did you get that? And that's when we found the Rosen bombs. And then by 1952, we have hydrogen bombs. And then all of a sudden, Russia gets hydrogen bombs. So obviously, we didn't seal up all the leaks. And that's the end of that.